You very much for joining us at this morning's Thoughtful Thursday session. My name's Aisling McDowell from Irish in Britain, and I'll be hosting today's session. For anyone joining us today who aren't familiar with us, Irish in Britain are a network organisation supporting and promoting the work and growth of a number of Irish organisations in Britain. So before I hand over to my colleague, there's a few bits of housekeeping for the session today. As with all our Thoughtful Thursday sessions, this is being recorded and will be uploaded onto our website as a learning resource. All attendees are on mute and your microphones are off, so you won't appear on screen. But if you'd like to make any contributions to today's session, which we encourage, you can do so using the chat function or the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. So please post any questions, queries, contributions in either of those boxes, and I'll be monitoring those throughout today. If there is anybody that doesn't wish to be emailed about any future sessions, then please do drop me a line in the chat or you can message me privately. I think that's probably all for housekeeping. So I will hand over now to Zibby. Zibby is our Quivener coordinator and she will just say a few words and she'll hand over to our speaker for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aisling, and a warm welcome to everybody who's joining us today from many different places. We know that we have people from different groups across our network, from London, from Birmingham, from Luton, from places across the country, and also people joining from Ireland as well. And we're very pleased to warmly welcome today Ultan Cowley. Many of you will know Ultan, and some of you may have joined a previous very well received session that we held before Christmas time. Ultan is back by popular request. We know that people are very, very interested in the reminiscence work that Ultan is doing, and Ultan of course is a historian and he's a well-known writer as well, and he's going to be talking to us today about on the topic of taking the votes and the experiences of people from Irish communities travelling backwards and forwards across from Ireland. We'll have a chance for questions. People are welcome to type questions into the chat, and we've already collected a lot of interest and a lot of questions from people that we will be touching on today in the session. So a very warm welcome, Ultan, and to introduce some of you who may be new to Ultan's work, to Ultan's oral history and reminiscence work, I'm going to ask Aisling to share a short film clip which is relating to a book that Ultan has published, The Men Who Built Britain. Thank you, Aisling.
Going to share that now. You might just let me know if the sound's okay on that.
Come, Irishmen, both young and stern, with adventure in your souls. There are better ways to spend your days than working down the hole. I was tall and true, all of 6'2", but they broke me across the back. And the name I'm known, and it's not my own, they call me Crooked Jack.
Memories of the Men Who Built Britain. Noel O'Donnell, Navy. Before I ever left home, I knew all you had to do was go to Camden Town and you'd get work. RSK's wagons were blue, Murphy's were green or grey, Pincher Macs were green. You wouldn't inquire where, what time, how long, what price, just jump on a wagon, and away you went. Men looking for the start were known as skins. They were judged by their boots. Billy O'Grady, Wexford son. You'd ask a guy where he came from to see if he could work. Mayo, a bit fiery but a good worker. Donegal, intelligent, decent and a reasonable worker. Leitrim, probably okay. Limerick, there's a bit of a buzz about it. Dublin, my own county. The little quick walk of the Dub was great behind the bar, but not much bloody good on a building site. you were digging out a road, you'd mark off every 35 yards with a piece of chalk, and you'd tell a new man, if you can't dig that out before this evening, don't come in tomorrow.
I was the ganger's blue-eyed boy, but Jack could do no wrong. And the reason simply was because I would work hours hard and long. I was tall and true, all of 6'2", but they broke me across the back. And the name I'm known, and it's not my own, they call me Crooked Jack.
Once in a lifetime that thing happened, when thousands of Irishmen congregated in those places. Men from the west, Kerry, Connemara, Mayo, Belmullet, Arranmore Island, Gweedore, Falcara. Hundreds of Irishmen every morning jumping on wagons. It was a fabulous old time, but it's part of history now. It'll never come again.
And they say that honest toil is good for the spirit and the soul. But believe me, boys, it's for sweat and blood that they want you down the hole. I was tall and true, all of 6'2", but they broke me across the back. And the name I'm known, and it's not my own, they call me Crooked Jack. I was tall and true, all of 6'2", but they broke me across the back. And the name I'm known, and it's not my own, they call me Crooked Jack.
Thank you, Aisling. And I'm now going to hand over to Ultan, who's going to share some reflections about what crossing the water by boat was like for people coming backwards and forwards from Ireland. So Ultan, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Zibby, and good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us here this morning. A little blast from the past there, and on the final piece from a reader's letter in relation to that book, The Men Who Built Britain, hence God rest those who were gone, and we certainly echo those sentiments. Various people have very kindly sent in different questions over recent days and weeks, and I'll just try and work through some of those, and if anybody wants to jump in and you have access, then feel free to do so. And you can get a rest from my voice maybe. So I'll just read off some questions I have here. Sorry, the wrong one there. The first one kind of struck me as strange initially, and I don't know if anybody ever gave much thought to it, in fact, as who were the people who worked on the boats. And nowadays, I think an awful lot of them are Polish. In those days, they were Irish, predominantly Irish and Welsh. And I still remember often envying them their indifference to the passengers going backwards and forwards, and their freedom to remain on board and head back after the voyage. Another question related to that was, how costly was it to take a boat from Ireland to England? Were tickets easy to come by? Were there different classes of tickets? How did ticket booking work in the pre-internet age? These are questions you wouldn't have to think about today. You know, at what point did it become popular and financially viable to take a plane rather than take a boat? And the answer, I suppose, to take each of those in turn is tickets were always affordable. That was the great thing about going to England. You could do it almost on a whim, you know, and because it was so easy to go over, the assumption was made it'd be just as easy to come back, but it didn't work like that. And the fares tended to be, I suppose, anywhere between 30 shillings, £3, £5, up to £10 from Dublin or Dunleary to London Euston, depending on the decade, 50s, 60s, 70s. And the tickets tended to be purchased at railway stations or from local agents down the country, as they say. They could be news agents or whatever, or they could be bought from the ferry company's offices in Dublin or Cork, which is what I would have done. And there were first and second class tickets. I never had the pleasure of traveling first class myself. And the idea of pre-booking by telephone would never have occurred to me, but perhaps it did to other people who were a bit more organized. And then travel by plane, I don't recall. I still occasionally, if I have to go to London, and my wife would be the same, if we have to go, we'll go, if it's all possible, by the sail rail option. I find it a more civilized way to travel, actually, and more less stressful. But I think flights came in as an affordable option, maybe in the late 70s. Other people might know more about that than I do. Certainly in the 80s, you had the so-called Ryanair generation, the next 500,000 who had to get out, but they could fly. And how long would a boat crossing take in the old days, and what kind of food would be sold on the boat? Again, I didn't know a whole lot about the food. How did people entertain themselves on the crossing? Well, the boat sailed certainly from Dún Laoghaire about 9 o'clock in the evening and has arrived at Holyhead about midnight. The train was known as the Irish Mail, would arrive in London Euston around 8 o'clock in the morning. And then if you went from the North Wall in Dublin itself, you'd be heading for Liverpool via Heysham. And that journey, actual voyage, took longer due to the cattle were stopping in the middle of the night at Heysham to be offloaded in the darkness. A horrible experience for them, and not very pleasant for the passengers either. And food on the boat, I think, consisted really of tea and sandwiches. I doubt there was hot food available other than maybe in first class. The crossings were usually crowded and uncomfortable with little seating, and many passengers having to remain on deck throughout. You saw that picture there earlier on of people on deck, but that was like in daylight leaving, probably of a summer's evening. And entertainment, that concept wouldn't enter anybody's heads, you know. Certainly this is the age, pre-internet age, no mobile phones, none of that stuff. Apart from the small bar down below decks for the hardened travellers, that didn't exist. People talked, and if at all possible, they slept through the voyage. But homeward journeys were very much a joyful contrast. And then the bar would ring to the music of mouth organs, fiddles, and tin whistles, and the pints flowed freely. I just switched back to the yeah. Is that okay for people? I'm sort of reading off the questions themselves and answering from that. Is that working for everybody?
Thank you, Ultan. Yes, please continue, and we'll also collect some questions to put to you as well. Thank you.
Okay, I'll continue to work on through. So, and then what kinds of things would people carry on the boat to Ireland and across to England as mementos and gifts, etc.? And was there a luggage allowance limit? That made me smile. It's a sweet question from habitual air travellers, I assume. And it was almost, I suppose, a point of honour for people to bring gifts home, and money, of course, if it hadn't been sent already. Particularly, I think girls were very diligent about, you know, bringing presents, bringing clothing, and so on and so forth in the harder times, excuse me. And they themselves always made sure that they were beautifully turned out, and showing that you know, things were good and they were good. The luggage allowance, of course, was boiled down to how much could be carried in a heavy suitcase, maybe with a couple of children hanging out of you, struggling down corridors and on and off trains and buses and so on. And then a related question coming from Ireland to Britain: what did people bring across with them to set up a home? And were there any foods that people would bring that couldn't be so easily found in England? Well, the Irish emigrated, as the historians have it, young, single, and alone. And so setting up home wasn't much on their minds at that point in time. And when they did, they had to, you know, scrimp and scrape and scratch around. And food, of course, from Ireland was always welcome, being much fresher and better. It was rationing prevailed right through the war, so from 39 right through until 1952 or 54, I think, and that was a serious matter. But sausages and bacon and butter from Ireland always got the big hello, and it wasn't unknown for food to be smuggled indeed in. And some dubs, I have to confess, made a tidy little living travelling backwards and forwards to Liverpool on a daily basis with contraband of that nature. There's a story told about a man who, you know, he was navying in London, and his mother sent him, coming up to Christmas, he sent him a turkey. And the lad, of course, had never had to really do much cooking for himself. So he got the turkey anyway. The turkey, fortunately, had been cleaned and plucked. So he got the heavy old gas cooker. He got a pan, put the turkey in the oven and lit up. And about 2 hours later, there was a massive explosion. The door blew off the oven, and bits of turkey flew everywhere because what the mammy had done was shove a bottle, actually, to customs, and Paddy suffered the consequences of that one. So it wasn't a great outcome. Were there rules on boats about children traveling unaccompanied, and could children under 16 travel without an adult? Again, a very interesting question, looking at those times from a modern perspective. And the answer really is that society in general is much less regulated than it is today. Ironically enough, people had an awful lot more actual personal freedom than they do today, and that is a sensitive topic now in the age of COVID. So very little attention would have been paid to an unaccompanied child once they were over the age of, say, 13 or 14. But again, in contrast to today, adults habitually showed kindness towards young people who were strangers to them if they seemed to be in need. And I've often been told stories about, we'll say somewhere in the west of Ireland, a young girl gets on the train and she's in tears and she's bound for Dublin and the boat, and it's her first time over. Again, would comfort her as best he could. But you can imagine how cynically that would be regarded in today's society. And what were busy times of year for crossing the boat, crossing by boat between England and Ireland? Well, I think Christmas time in the 40s, 50s, when things were tough, you know, and there wasn't a lot of money around. And then maybe in the 60s, 70s and onwards, mainly in the summertime, especially for families. And by the 70s, you're into the era of the roll-on, roll-off ferry, which was a massive vessel in comparison with the older boats, with stabilizers and everything and all the comforts. Those crossings were horrendous in bad weather, and you know, crossing at Christmas was a serious matter because you had to go back again, and the weather, as it still does, you know, would turn very nasty in the new year. So summer was the favorite time. And what sort of immigration checks could be carried out? The British were no slouches and still aren't at regulating who comes and who goes. In the war years and through into the early 50s, travel permits were issued by the Irish government in liaison with the British, and there were work permits issued by the British themselves. You saw a picture of one of those there at the top of that little clip. There were national registration identity cards, and the Irish issued something called a travel identity card, which is that one there. I don't know if you can see that properly. And I think it ended about possibly 1948, possibly into the 50s. But Donald McCowley has a very funny little story in his book, An Irish Navvy, about meeting the customs. He says, what a to-do there was about our bags. You'd think that there was one man who shoved onto the counter an old battered case that was tied with a bit of rope to keep it shut. What have you got there? Said the customs officer. Ah, you're a nothing at all, said my lad with a grin. Open it up all the same, said your man. Asher's hardly worth my while, said Paddy. Look here, you're only wasting both our times. I can't let you through until you open that bag. Fair enough, said my lad, and drew out of his pocket a bloody big jackknife with which he cut the rope around the case. The lid jumped up just like a jack-in-the-box, and out leapt an old pair of Wellington boots that had been twisted up inside it. Divil the thing else was in the case, not even a change of socks. A melancholy, wintry little smile crossed the face of the customs officer as he motioned to your man to get along with himself. So, yeah, it had its moments, that experience. And then the very relevant question of how did people send money back? And the answer is that what didn't come home as a ball of notes in the back pocket came as cash in the letter, the famous letter, or the wire, which was a telegram, redeemable for X amount of money at the local post office. And in rural Ireland, the postman's stately progress on his bicycle was very closely watched. When he stopped at a house, and shortly afterwards the woman of that house was seen to mount her high Nelly and head for town, the neighbours knew that the letter had arrived. And it might be remarked of the dutiful emigrant son or daughter, weren't they the great rearing? Surely. And I have a very nice photograph here of taken in Kilmore Quay, which is about 20 minutes away from where I am now, down on the south coast, of a postman delivering the letter on his Honda 50 bicycle to a young boy outside the cottage, and to the left of the telegraph lighter colour, and that is the Irish Sea. And there's a pussycat in the window of the house waiting to get in. So I would guess that it's, and the postman has a big heavy overcoat. I'd say it was a cold winter's morning. But there's the letter arriving, safe and sound. And there is, in fact, a bicycle just behind the wall there, ready for the trip to town. Yeah, how we doing? Anybody got any comments on any of that so far? Or?
Thank you, Ultan. I'm going to bring in Mary and Anne at this point to ask a question. So Mary, would you like to turn on your video? Mary, of course, is our Quivner patron, and many of you will know her as through Irish in Britain.
Hi, Ultan. Hi, everybody. Warm welcome to everybody here. It's really, it's bringing back memories. I was of the generation who came by plane. It was a struggle for my parents, but we actually came by plane. But I stayed with an aunt and uncle here who, the uncle insisted on going back to Ireland every year at Christmas with 3, maybe 4 small children, and he would head off to the bar, and Aunt would be left upstairs looking after these children and the suitcases, getting on and off the various trains. From, I think they probably went to Rosslare. And she always dreaded that. She hated going home to Ireland because he always ended up lathered by the time he got there. And she had small cranky children with her. So there will be other people who will have similar recollections, I'm sure.
I think so, yeah. Some things never change, Mary.
No, I think not.
as there was a saying, had it over there in those days too. 2 went to the altar, but only 1 got married.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be a horrendous, absolutely horrendous journey, I think, for people. And yeah, depending.
But I've also heard them talking about coming over on the Princess Maud, which was little better than a cattle boat.
Yes. Yeah.
And if the sea was bad and people were sick, you know, you're kind of up to your ankles in puke at that point.
Puke and porter, yeah.
Puke and porter, yeah, or both, yeah.
Or both, yeah.
Yeah.
Terrible. Yeah. And you'd sleep in corridors, you'd sleep on luggage racks, you'd sleep anywhere you could get a space, you know.
That's right,
a reclining seat or anything like that, you know. Yeah, there were berths, weren't there? For those who could afford.
And I just put something in chat which reminded me when I first started nursing. One of my colleagues came from, I think she came from County Mayo. She had come over on the boat, and she was so young. She was actually reading the Bunty magazine. I don't know whether anybody remembers the Bunty magazine, but it was a magazine for very young teenage girls. and she had bought it for herself as she sat bawling on the top deck. She was so homesick.
Ah, dear, yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It was quite, you see, well, the question, Mary, is, of children, unaccompanied children. A lad or a girl of 16 or 17 would look like a child in those days. Extraordinarily well. They were very naive and innocent in comparison, but also, they didn't have the fashion and they didn't have the access to the makeup and so on and so forth. They really were innocents abroad,
Absolutely. And often the first time they'd ever been on a train, let alone out of their, their local parish.
Yeah. And I think somebody was asking about what did people do? Well, in relation to construction, what had they, where did they find accommodation when they went over? How did they find work and so on? And so many, and the girls too they'd have been sent off a little more than children, but just with an address, maybe a phone number. Good luck with that. Make your own way, kind of thing. It's there'd be prosecutions left, right, and centre today if this sort of thing went on. That's what I mean.
And often maybe a sister or a friend or somebody like that might be meeting them, but they wouldn't have been able to take the time off work.
True.
To go and meet them. So my aunt, my aunt actually told me about. She had instructions of where to get the bus, and she was told to get off at the high street. So she got on the right number bus and asked for a ticket to the high street. And they said, which high street? Yeah. She didn't have a clue which high street she was going to.
Yeah.
So, very innocent, very, very raw. Yeah.
Information at third hand, very, very raw. Extraordinarily so. I think it's unimaginable.
It is now,
people today or modern people, There we go. I could look.
I don't know if Anne's got any comments, anything to ask.
Yeah. So we will bring in Anne now. He's one of our Cleveland volunteers. So, Anne, would you like to go next?
Hello, everyone. So Ultan, yes. When you were talking, it reminded me of my mother and her trip here in, I think it must have been about 1949. And she was only 16, and she came with her older sister who was 17. And they came from West Cork, from a small farm there, into Golders Green, into London. And I remember Mum saying there was no preparation. It was such a shock, a great learning curve. But I remember, like you were saying, if this happened now, it wouldn't happen. My mother passed earlier than my father, and I remember having a conversation with my father about 20 years ago, and he was reflecting on it. And he said it wasn't a good thing to send people with no experience whatsoever into such a city. It was really a very brave thing to do, but thankfully they were looked after by their communities. And in my mother's case, obviously, she stayed safe. But there was a scheme, I don't know where they went into as like au pairs, but I don't think it was called that, as home health. So at 16, she joined a family in Golders Green. And also my mother-in-law, who's from Connemara, she came later, and she went into a family in Baker Street. And I'm just thinking of the reflection she had. It was she lived on an island off Ireland, and she worked for quite a well-to-do family in Baker Street. And we're talking about COVID now, but the man of the house used to work in the city, and he was so concerned about getting infections, he used to douse himself in TCP before he left the house. But when he got up the tube, he wouldn't catch anything. That was I just remember her finding that so funny. But yes, as you said, Ultan, these children would not have been left to leave as they were in those days.
No way, no.
To come here. Yeah. But thankfully, both my mother and mother-in-law had a good life in England, but could quite easily, when you hear of what is out there, might not have, I'm sure not everybody had a good experience. But anyway, they had a good experience.
Yeah.
Just it brought back the memories. the
how
boat
many
journey.
did, yeah. It worked out very well for an awful lot of people when you think about it. But that toughness and tenacity and common sense stood them in good stead, you know.
Absolutely.
And again, I think in relation to somebody asked about girls and women and what opportunities were there for them and where did they find work and how did they get on. And I think while education was minimal for both sexes, I mean, 84% of the immigrants in the 50s and into the 60s, 51 to 61, had left school before the age of 14. But the girls, very often, if they had been educated in convent schools, got more of a grounding in, I suppose, personal hygiene and comportment, manners, and so on and so forth, so that they made good domestic servants and fitted into what they call now the hospitality sector quite readily, you know, the hotels and so on and so forth. An awful lot of employment in hotels, but many others got into nursing, so they had that kind of grounding. And I suppose that's where maybe there's a positive aspect to the old dictum, speak when you're spoken to, and don't do as I do as I tell you. In other words, obedience, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
The girls would have taken that more on board, I think, than the fellas, but it meant that they were more likely to listen when they were being given instructions and directions and training and so on. So, you know, that worked for them, I think. And they're much more, of course, responsible generally, and still are, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you. I just thought I'd mention that. That's my comment. Thank you, Ultan.
I just want to come back if I can, and I'm glad you mentioned nursing, because nursing offered accommodation, it offered a career, and it was a job that you didn't have to pay to do in this country, whereas you had to pay generally in Ireland to train as a nurse. But the point I wanted to make, horrific as it seems, sending 16 and 17-year-olds to a very strange country, I think it's easy to forget that there was very little in Ireland for the vast majority of people at an earlier time. There was no work, and very sadly, there was a lot of nepotism there. If you didn't know the right people, you know, you had... True. No matter how clever, how hardworking, how diligent you were, there were very few choices for people there.
Yeah. That's very true, Mary. Yeah.
And remember, you know, there wasn't electricity until maybe the late 50s or the 60s for many people. And I think the other thing that I don't want us to forget is, while a lot of people left Ireland for socio-economic reasons, a lot of people left because of their sexuality, women who came because they were pregnant and unmarried. We've got lots of, I say, secrets in inverted commas in the community as well. So, you know, tough as it was and heartbreaking as it was for parents and the community, there really wasn't an awful lot for people there. And we, you know, it was a family necessity.
Yeah, it was, and there were reasons for this, I think, that need more investigation. And I was looking at that in relation to some of the questions that were asked. We've talked about the money coming home, and somebody said, well, and what was dry money, which is something I refer to in my CD, The Voices of the Men Who Built Britain. I have a man talking to me about dry money over in North Kerry. And very interesting listening it made too. And dry money was what the head of the household had in the bank. It used to be shoved up into the thatch or up behind the fireplace. The big old notes, you know, that you could wrap yourself up in to stop them going mouldy. And that was the money you had against eviction, or, you know, pay the rates, pay the rent, whatever. And then when the banks moved into rural Ireland, the money was brought into the bank, but that was what the head of the household had, and nobody else knew how much until he or she was dead. So sons and daughters who were reared for emigration dutifully added to it, week on week, and maybe for a lifetime, but they had little to show for it. It's, you know, the old thing, the home nest could maintain but one, and the hard road for the others. And I was asked, well, what were some of the factors that prompted people to leave Ireland, and what drew people across the boat to England? Well, that's push-pull, isn't it? And the pull was excitement. It was freedom from the scrutiny of priests and parents. And it was also a reaction to discrimination, both social and sexual, and the casual cruelty that was endemic in Irish society. It's very tempting to say simply, well, there were too many people and too few opportunities, and England was almost the opposite. But by 1958, the population of Ireland had reached an all-time low of 2.8 million. That's hardly overcrowding. I mean, it's now over 4.8 million. It seems to be work for everybody. And yeah, there was a stagnant economy, but there was also a mismanaged one. As I said there, 82% of the ones who emigrated had left school before the age of 14. And why? Well, because secondary schools were fee paying. And you have to ask yourself, well, was that deliberate? I mean, a nation's people are its human capital. And modern Ireland shows that once you educate them, people become productive and the nation prospers. So why 3 and 4 and 5 decades after independence were so many still being forced to emigrate without any training or education to work in Britain? And I found that part of the answer is in Alexis Fitzgerald's remarks in the report of the Commission on Emigration of 1954. And that's very, very interesting reading. And Fitzgerald said, in the order of values, it seems more important to preserve and improve the quality of Irish life and thereby the purity of that message, meaning Christianity, which our people have communicated to the world, than it is to reduce the number of Irish emigrants. High emigration, granted a population excess, releases social tensions which would otherwise explode and makes possible a stability of manners and customs which would otherwise be the subject of radical change. So the question has to be asked, Mary, who got to stay at home and to preserve and improve the quality of Irish life and enjoy the stability of manners and customs? Well, the Investment in Education report of 1962 stated that professional and white-collar workers, who were 20% of the working population in 1961, obtained 65% of the university places in that year. And manual workers, who were 25% of the working population, gained only 2% of university places because secondary schooling was fee-paying. And then there was an economic historian, James Meenan, I found with a very interesting observation, and he said, and I think it nails it here really, emigration has prevented the emergence of an immense surplus of labour and an inevitable driving down of all salaries and wages. It has allowed those who remain at home to enjoy a standard of living which is not justified by the volume of their production. And it reminds me of the modern civil service here. But emigration has made life in Ireland more leisurely and less disturbed by class warfare. And if emigration ended suddenly, that life would become much more competitive and much less remunerative. And class warfare was a code really for socialism. The all-powerful Catholic Church was the sworn enemy of socialism. I mean, James Joyce summed it up in a little doggerel verse. Ireland, my one and only love, where Christ and Caesar are hand in glove.
Brilliant. Yeah.
It doesn't make pleasant listening, does it? You know,
no, I mean, when I did my research in the late 90s, people, you know, many people I interviewed told me tales of, you know, themselves working very hard at school and applying for jobs, but somebody who was connected to that particular firm or the civil service actually got the job, even though they were, you know, they were less intelligent and worked less hard.
Yeah, I have them around here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of it about, as they say.
I think there is, yeah. But I think, you know, we've got to balance that out. Many people have had a difficult life as migrants. And continue to have a difficult life in this country, but other people have had opportunities. I've had great opportunities that I probably wouldn't have had at home.
No.
And I'm sure there are others like me.
Many people have said that to me, Mary, and I have my own experience too. You know, I mean, I left Ireland at 15 because my parents couldn't have, they were actors and traveling actors. They couldn't afford secondary education for me. And it was a boy entrance in the Royal Air Force. And there's a lot of barstool patriots around here today who will go on about, oh, you know, traitors and this and that and British uniform and so on. Well, 12 out of the 20 people in my billet in basic training camp were from the Republic. And the statistic would have been much higher in the army than in the Air Force, because it was a way of getting out, getting a start. You know, whatever opportunities, whatever doors open for you. I mean, I'm a low-sized dub, so I could forget about the construction industry, as I said there in that little film clip.
Yeah.
The little quick walk with the dub was great behind the bar, but not much bloody good on the building site. So you had to use your head, you know. But then, like a lot of the lads in construction used their heads. They looked up from the trench and they said, well, you know, there's money being made here. How is it being done? And then they started asking questions and working the head. And that could take them a long, long way. So inherent intelligence and ability, you know, that could have been put to work for Ireland was being put to work in Britain. And people at home then benefited from that indirectly, didn't they?
Oh, I think they did. I don't remember the exact figures or indeed the exact time, but sometime in the early 60s, the amount of money, the amount of remittances that could be counted was pretty similar to the education budget at that time. And that was just the stuff that was sent as postal orders or checks, not the fiver, not the £1 actually, the punt in the letter,
the ball of notes in the back pocket,
yeah.
That's very true, very true.
Thank you, Ultan and Mary. We're having some reflections and comments and questions coming in to the chat, and we do encourage everybody tuning in to feel free to share reflections and comments. We have one from somebody who remembers their dad commenting that there were bursaries given when he was at school, and then years later he found out that they actually went to the school teacher's family, so the theme of education. But we had also an interesting reflection from one of the participants here. He said that they know that their mum travelled over from Ireland with geraniums in the lining of her coats. They remember a friend talking about taking the car on the plane, and there's a photo of that plane actually in an exhibition at Cork Airport.
Wow, that's very
and they also remember.
I know you could take a plane from Kent to Calais, you know, to cross the Channel. I don't know about it, never heard of that happening from Ireland, but I've no doubt that it did, and it would have been fairly well-heeled people who could afford to take the car as well as themselves on the plane. It was hard enough to find the fare to use the plane. What was it, about £200, Mary, or the bones thereof to fly from Dublin to London or vice versa back in the 50s, early 60s? It was extraordinary money anyway. You had to be quite comfortably off to be able to fly, you know.
They also reflect on the way that the boats were decorated or upholstered. They remember back in the 60s, the ferry breaking down, travelling to Ireland on the Princess Maud, that it was a rough sea and a tough crossing. But they remember the mahogany fittings down below.
Yeah, absolutely, The boat train, the Irish Mail leaving from Euston was a great experience too. You were in little compartments in those days with a through corridor, you know, that you see in old Agatha Christie movies or whatever. But up and down the corridor, you'd see lads walking with bottles of stout. They'd go down to the bar and get the bottles of stout, and the drinking would start as soon as the train left the station, really. So they'd be, as Mary said, be fairly well oiled by the time they got to, or was it Anne? Yes, by the time they got to Holyhead, you know. And I don't think there were any other than that. There wasn't much in the way of refreshments on the train either. And then down into, but the atmosphere was terrific. The atmosphere was electric, you know. It was a wonderful thing. And then coming into I remember coming into Dún Laoghaire in the early morning, and the men in the washrooms with the braces down round their hips and the vest stripped to the vest, and they'd be shaving, and there'd be brill cream in the hair, and oh, the tie and everything, all the best of everything ready for the boat, the bus to Ballina, or wherever it was. Marvelous experience, marvelous atmosphere, and of course the opposite then heading back, particularly after Christmas. There's a Ryer film called Oldbury Camp, I think, about life on the one of the power stations in the west of Britain, and yeah, the local the chaplain there talked about collecting. He used to collect men from off the boat and bring them back to the camp and so on, and he talked about the atmosphere of gloom and so on coming back. But they used to get home about every 6 weeks from those power stations, so they weren't too badly off at all in that regard, As their vanished times, it's very difficult to summon up or conjure up the atmosphere and the pace of life, I suppose, and the sense of, paradoxically enough, individuality that people developed, whether they liked it or not. The sense when you were in the country, you were part of a community, and you had the support of your community, and your status was determined by the community's assessment of you. But when you went to Britain, you were to a great extent on your own. I mean, yeah, I know that there was community, there was GAA, and there was the Irish centres and so on. But a lot of the time, and in places where those things weren't an option, it was a lonely life for people. But they developed a sense of themselves and their own individuality, or not, as the case might be. Mostly, I think, though, they did. So it's hard to conjure that up, today, where everybody is an individual when they're looking at their phone and they're on social media, but actually, in reality, they're, I don't know. It's a different thing. I'm wallowing around here trying to get at something, and maybe somebody else is maybe putting their fingers on it better than I am. It's a long time, isn't it? 50, 60 years from
Thank you, Ultan. We have a reflection from one of the participants about how in 1961 alone, in that year, an estimated £13.5 million was sent to Ireland by immigrants in the United Kingdom, which almost equaled the entire education budget of £14 million. So,
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. I think that's in Catherine Dunn's book about it. But I know that 2.3 billion was sent home between 1939 and 1969 in quantifiable remittances. And as Mary said, that doesn't take account of the money that was brought home in more unorthodox ways. So it's a vast amount of money coming in, and the government were well aware of it, and remittances were a factor in the Exchequer's calculations of the budgetary calculations in any given year. But at the same time, the government were saying, well, they're not our responsibility. What have they got to do with us? And ironically enough, it was only the Catholic Church that did take an interest for their own reasons. Oh, we have to save souls here and heat in England. But they did put, practical measures in place to provide some help on the ground, and that was appreciated. Another point that one of the questions was brought up early on was how difficult it was for Irish people even giving birth without the support of family, and again that brings me back to that point about so many from rural Ireland. And in rural Ireland, you are part of a collective and part of a community, and when people found themselves in Britain having to cope with those everyday matters of family and so on, that support wasn't there. Now, there was official support, of course, on a level that they might not have been able to get through the NHS in Ireland itself. But the sense of not being, well, where was the mammy? A woman she talked about her mother giving birth and being in a ward surrounded by English women who had all their relations piling in on top of them, and everybody, making a big fuss. And this poor woman was there on her own because her husband was, couldn't come in, or in fact, it probably wouldn't have been let in those days. He was too busy working, So she had to carry that all on her own. You know, it's yeah, another day. So how are we doing here for time? We're running out. Actually, time is flying by. I just want to refer back to some of the questions that I was. Yeah, so really, I suppose to sum it up from my end, if you were one of those tens of thousands who took the boat across all those generations, this really is what all the statements and all the official statements and official statistics boil down to. And again, I'd refer to the words of Donald McCowley, who wrote that book, an Irish Navvy. It was Deal and Jory, Diary of an Exile, published in Irish and then translated as An Irish Navvy, Diary of an Exile. In 1954, this is the first edition. So at the very end of the book, he's been home. He worked in construction, and he's been home for a short holiday to Kilkenny. And he's just writing about what it was like, you know, going back 2 hours on the train to Dublin. I had a good short holiday and I shouldn't be unhappy. But after all, I envy the cattle lying on the green grass of Ireland, gazing cow-like at CIE carriages riding by. But even the cattle are trundled across too, like the Paddies and Bridgets of Ireland. Coming into Dún Laoghaire, I saw men in white clothes playing cricket, and somehow I felt annoyed. A young man and his girl were walking by themselves down below us in the golden evening sunlight. It's well for you, my friends, that every day you arise can be spent around about this place. The Baud Bawn, the white boat, is laden down with people, most of them, I fancy, like myself, returning after Easter. I can see too that others are going across for the first time. On my right, there's a little group from Connemara talking in Irish. Doesn't Dún Laoghaire look beautiful with the mountains behind it? The quay is lined with little sailing boats and wooden rowing boats. The wealthy own them, those who can stay behind here. And then without warning, she drifts away from the quay. The Wicklow Mountains are on the right, merging into the darkness of the night. Do their colours change, I wonder, like the 12 bends? I can sense that old feeling in my stomach that I get each time I leave Irish soil, but it won't last long. I am getting used to it now. The sun has gone down now, but there are faint golden rays in the west still. Somewhere around me, a man is singing The Rose of Tralee. Somebody else is telling a story. We're a great people, surely.
Thank you so much, Ultan. It's been really very rich and reflexive session, this session. We're very nearly at the end of our time for this webinar. Thank you, Ultan, and also thank you to Mary, of course, and Anne, who joined us as panelists today. We know that people are here from different groups, and to let you know that Safe Home Ireland has shared a message about an event that they are involved with in May, I think is coming up with Ultan, and we will certainly share that through our social media and our Irish in Britain member network. So thank you for sharing that. Mary, would you like to say some closing remarks?
Just thank you very much to Ultan for a really thoughtful and sometimes challenging talk. I think it's very easy to forget just how difficult it has been for people who emigrated. It happened a long time ago, and some of the questions actually reflect the fact that, you know, families often have very little understanding of the kind of backstory of their parents and other relatives. So this has been really informative, and I think it can form the basis for resources for reminiscence that people can use with their families, or volunteers or staff can actually use in our community organisations. So this has been really helpful, very, very thoughtful and very passionate, Ultan. So Garamila Mahagat from all of us here.
No, Backlash, Mila Bukas, and I wish you everybody the very best in carrying on. You know, we've all seen the 2 days, but with the help of God and a few policemen, we'll see a few more. And
we will.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. And I'll leave it with you.
Thank you.